Welcome back to She Can, where women lead by example. We interview women from all over the world and all walks of life about their journey, how they got to where they are today. To be role models and mentors for others, they share their stories and their insights. And it's easier to be what you can see, which is why we're here. I'm very excited to talk to Kelsie Brook Eckert today. Kelsie, welcome to She Can. You're an award-winning history teacher and the coordinator of social studies education at Plymouth State University in the US, and the executive director of the Remedial Herstory Project, which is a very powerful project, and we're going to talk all about it. You're also a podcaster. You wrote a book, Teaching Women's History, Breaking Barriers and Undoing Male Centrism in K-12 Social Studies. You're on the Council for Social Studies. You're a board member and the ex-president of the same. So tell us a little bit more in your own words, how you got to where you are today.
Oh, well, it started mostly because I was a high school social studies teacher. I'm a raging feminist. And I realized that as much as I wanted to teach about women in my classes, I didn't know anything about women to teach.
Mm,
And I started to think, well, that's strange. I am a certified social studies teacher. Like the state of New Hampshire has approved me. And I have a master's degree. And at the time, and I'm like, how of all people am I not the one teaching women's history? And so my journey really started from that question of all people, how am I not doing this right? And it led me to researching my book, it started initially just by exploring the barriers, right? How did I get to where I am to not be prepared to do this? And if that was my journey, how could we train teachers differently? How can we bring teachers along so that they're prepared and ready to fix what I think is a really big problem, which is that, when we think of history, our definition of what that is, what that looks like, and I say we meaning like culturally,
yeah.
is very male centered. And studies show that between 5 and 20% of school curriculum, and it varies obviously. In the United States, we have state level departments of ed that really
Mm,
dictate curriculum. So I think people abroad sometimes don't appreciate that, like where I am in New Hampshire is very different than in Mississippi or California or Missouri. And but what I found when I started looking into this more is that 5 to 20% is pretty accurate no matter where we're talking about.
yeah.
Um, uh, and that's true, I think, in the UK where you are. Um, and like how can we start to shift that so that when we think of our story as a human race, it includes women and we
Yeah.
don't erase women in that story. Because we also see in a modern day, every day, the erasure of women. Literally, I mean, there were extreme right groups that photoshopped Hillary Clinton out of images of the Situation Room at different points in when major
Mm.
events happened in our recent history. So it's like that, like we're literally photoshopping women out where they are, which is just fascinating. And to me, we have to fix the way that we see our story in order to see women who they are, as powerful as they are, as whole and complete as they are right now, if we don't change the way we see them in the past. And
Yeah.
your phrase, I completely agree with. We need these models in order to become what we can't see right now.
Kelsie, exactly, which I love. I love that this matters to you. I love that's how you want to matter in the world. I think you are obviously teaching teachers now to make a difference here. You've mentioned that around 5% of the history curriculum is spent on women, which obviously, given that we represent 50% of the world population, is a tiny amount. I think if we look at data points, they're all pretty depressing, and which is why we are here trying to make a difference, and we couldn't be more aligned if we tried, um because representation matters, and if we can't see the things in front of us, then it's very difficult to get there, or much more difficult. So I'm wondering, take us back a little bit. Why are we where we are? I think we need to delve into a little bit that, men have, it's not only male centric, it's really almost predominantly male. And that's the people who write the history books, that's the people we discuss in history lessons, that's the role models we have, and that goes across all our societal setup or makeup, and that's still the case, and it's a little bit changing in the business world, and people are trying to make a difference. We're trying to make places more inclusive, but really we are missing women's insights in every industry, on every decision making table, and certainly looking at history in our past.
Mhm. So, I mean, the answer is that's why I took a book, right? So the answer is like so many things have gotten us to this moment. Um, you have to put history and the way we view history in the framework of power and who had the power. And historians, you've heard the phrase probably a million times, right? Victors get to write the history. And
Mm,
we forget, and that's true, right? Like when one civilization conquers another civilization, they get to tell the story of what happened because there's no one left from the other civilization to talk about it.
yeah.
The tricky thing is, in ancient, medieval, early modern history, a lot of historians were court historians. So they are hired by the king, by the court to write the story, right? And so they're going to write stories that are favorable. We have to sort of situate historical knowledge in the framework of who has power. And we also have to situate that in part of the power dynamic, the gendered power dynamics of our long history is the intentional illiteracy of women. And when women do not have access to the means to tell their own stories for most of history, then we're creating a dynamic right there that's going to create this sort of 5 to 20% framework that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Um, women, there are throughout history literate women. Elite women have always been literate and educated and prepared to rule. We forget, in our modern democracies, we forget that monarchies created a path to power for women. Empires had paths to power for women. And so, those women needed to be educated enough to rule just like men. And so they got, kind of male, and I put it in quotes, like male educations, right? Whereas other women were getting these different educations, and it was word of mouth. It was sometimes written down in training manuals, but often not. And that really shifts what we know about the past. The other thing we have to appreciate is a lot of our modern history was written by 19th century male historians as the field is
Mm,
becoming professionalized and there's like degrees. And so some of the erasure of women's history happened there by probably unconscious bias that those professional male historians had. Um, and the example I use a lot in class is English historians looking at the history of the Vikings, studying the remains of Viking warriors, seeing these bodies, and assuming that because they're buried with shields and spears, they're male. And in
mm,
fact, now that we have DNA evidence, we know that those historians were wrong. And what that tells us is just how much the bias of the historian impacts the story that we tell.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that all those Viking women buried with shields were in fact warriors, but it tells us there's more to the story, right? That of the Viking experience. Um, and then, one of the marks, there are lots of really interesting women who ruled and made history. Like I think of Fredegund and Brunhild in France. And their stories, I wouldn't say were completely erased, but they definitely were cast as these like dark women. And there is this pattern in history of men who rule after women who sort of use the femaleness of the previous regime to say like, and that's why it's better that I'm ruling now. And so
Mhm.
they go through and they rewrite the history of the women who ruled before them.
Yeah.
And so there are many examples through history where we see men coming later erasing or rewriting the story of women. And we get these, like on Star Network right now, they have a series called The Serpent Queen about Catherine de Medici. And, like, was she really a serpent queen? Like, or is that just the people who came later rewriting and retelling
Yeah.
her story?
Yeah. I
So
think,
it's
yeah.
tough. I think, in short, I think this is there are so many things that lead to the history we know about women being limited. And yet I think that also becomes the biggest excuse for people not to dig and find the women that are there. And there are so many women throughout all of time. Literally, you can go back to Mesopotamia and teach about Kubaba, who's on the Sumerian kings list, like, so you can go back as far as you want to include women. It's just, so I think we need to stop letting that be the excuse to not do it.
See, I think if I look at you, you're really able to bring very complicated and complex concepts and data and facts and make them concise and bite-sized and interesting to our young people and all of us, really. Tell us a little bit how did you realize that this is something that A interests you and B you're really good at?
Thank you. Oh gosh, I don't know. The ability to distill it down with fact and data, um, that I think this speaks again to some of the how did we get here. A lot of the fields that encompass the social studies are very male dominated. The American Historical Association has said that the male centrism of the field, like 40% of undergraduates graduating with a history degree are women right now. 40%, that's way less than half, and it's not on par with other humanities subjects.
Mm.
And my undergrad degree is in political science, and I remember distinctly being in a room of um, 18 boys and myself in my freshman seminar on presidential leadership. And
Wow.
um, and I went to college in the 21st century. Like I'm not that old. So
Mm.
I think I learned really young that if I'm gonna hang in this good old boys club that is my field, um, it can't be a feminist rant. It has to be grounded in evidence and data to bring my male peers along with me.
Yeah.
In that very class, we had to debate. This was before Hillary Clinton ran for president. So at the time, it was a very hypothetical question. But could a woman successfully run for president? And it was me and 18 boys in the class.
Wow.
So it's, obviously there were lots of awesome guys in that class with me. So there was a team of us that could make the case for a hypothetical Hillary Clinton. But, and what was wild about it at the time was that it was solely grounded in could a woman, like not just like, like we didn't really have a particular woman in mind. She was just the most likely person at the time. Um, So that was just fascinating. I don't know why I'm good at it. I think it's just a lot of practice, and being in these spaces with other men and with men and realizing that if I'm going to get through to them, it really has to be grounded in this. And
Yeah.
I don't know that I always win that sort of public relations, but I think it's harder to argue with data.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about this project. You also did a TED talk about it, the Remedial Herstory Project. Tell us a little bit more, and what do you want to achieve with that? And what are your main lessons since doing it?
Oh, well, so the big thing was I realized there were a lot of podcasts, and a lot of people talking about, there are several TED Talks out there about the lack of women's history in schools and the lack of knowledge that people have about history. The quote that always stands out to me is from Cicero, and I'm going to butcher it, but essentially, like, a person who doesn't learn their history remains forever a child. And if we think about the history of coverture and the treatment of women and trying to keep them alongside children and not really achieving full adulthood and full citizenship, denying women their history seems like a really great way to reinforce that and keep us fighting the same battles generation after generation
Yeah.
because we don't know our own story.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm listening to these TED Talks, and as much as I am right there with the women who are raising these issues and this awareness, I felt like, okay, enough lamenting this. Like, this is a very serious problem. The American Historical Association, Robert Townsend, has said this is the number one demographic problem, the lack of women getting history degrees and therefore not becoming history teachers. It's cyclical, right? Is contributing to it. And we also know that people tend to write about people that are like them. And
Yeah.
so studies show that 6% of male historians write about women, right? Like, and
Mm,
that you can't fault them for that, right? You're gonna look at the subjects you pick and want to write about people that are like you. Like, there's a reason I want to write about Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul and Ida B. Wells Barnett, like, because I think they're awesome and they're similar to me in personality. So so we can't fault the male historians, but we've got to do something to fix this problem. And the Remedial Herstory Project really came about out of this, like, we've got to do something. We've got to help girls see themselves in history so that they see themselves studying history, so that they see themselves teaching history, and so that they become historians and write about women in history, right? Like, we need all those things, because the other thing is, like, teachers can't make stuff up. They can't be like, women existed and let me make
mm,
up a story about it, right? They have to have scholarship to teach, right? So
yeah.
we need all these pieces. And the neat thing about this moment we're in right now is that we have decades of women's scholarship, women's studies, women's history. I interview people all the time for our podcast about the books they've written, and it's just such a cool moment right now. Like, we're at this tipping point, I think,
Yeah.
where we can start to make it happen. And one of the barriers I discovered in my research, and this comes from studies out of the UK, out of the United States, people talking about teachers saying, like, oh, I would love to teach women's history. I don't know anything about it. And then, more importantly, when I try to find stuff about it, there's nothing out there online.
Yeah.
And a lot of teachers do that, right? They look for really high quality lesson plans and then adapt them, manipulate them, whatever. And you could do this, like, pick a topic that you're interested in and Google lesson plans on women in blank, and it doesn't exist, or it didn't exist. And so what the Remedial Herstory Project started as was, I basically was like, I want to build a lesson for every era of US and world history, so that when a teacher does that, they Google women in the French Revolution, something actually comes up.
Yeah.
And it might not be the best thing ever, but, like, let's give them a leg up. And so since then, I think they're actually really awesome. And the feedback that we've gotten from teachers has been these aren't just good women's history resources, they're some of the best social studies resources out there. We've won grants from the Library of Congress here in the US, and they've sponsored, the lesson plans we've built. And so now, we have people build the draft, I review it for pedagogy, and then we send it to a scholar who's an expert in this, and we have the funds to pay them, which is so cool. And it's really just trying to like hit the ground running. One of the things I found in my research is that teachers who identify as feminists are more likely to teach women's history. And feminists are not exclusive to women, right? So there are male feminists
Exactly.
out there who are awesome. And if I can just give them the tools to teach it, then they can do it. And a lot of those, one of the interesting things, there was a study in Massachusetts that surveyed in a Black male teacher who was really versed in teaching about race in the classroom and felt really confident and capable in that. And he said, if I just had a little bit more resources and support, I think I could apply what I do on race to issues of gender and sexuality as well. And so, like, hi, let me give you the stuff, young man. That has been our goal, is to not lament and just like hit the ground running. And we are only able to do that because of the generations of women older than me who did the scholarship and did the research and dove into that archive and found the primary sources and digitized the primary sources to make all of that possible now in the 21st century. So it's really fun. And I think what we're building is, like obviously when you teach about women, the effect is going to be that people empathize more with the female experience. The effect is going to be that we start to wonder, like, we start to ask the perennial question of where are women?
Mm.
And, if you're sitting at a board meeting and you realize, oh my gosh, it's all men in this room, where are women and why aren't they on this board? Or you're an engineer and you go, where are all the female engineers, right? If we start to get students thinking like that by teaching about women and start to point out their absence, they're going to note, male and female students will start to notice that when they leave the classroom. And I'm just really excited about the change that could create in societies.
Kelsie, and when I listen to you, I get so excited because that's really the bottom line and the platform of which to build upon an equity, diversity, and inclusion sort of future. And so I'm so excited by your work. What tips would you have for young girls that are listening to this? Where shall they start?
Oof. So I think one of the interesting, so we just got a resolution passed at the National Council for Social Studies. This is one of our biggest accomplishments so far as an org. We passed a resolution demanding gender parity in state social studies standards by 2030. I'm now tasked with looking at the New Hampshire state social studies frameworks and figuring out where could I suggest people add women in here? And in doing that, I've actually uncovered another problem, which is I don't find that standards are overwhelmingly biased. The problem is how we interpret those standards as the educators in the room. And this is a new problem I'm uncovering, which is that, if they say teach about X topic, teachers go, oh, okay, cool. Like, using the French Revolution, like, okay, Robespierre, got it. Okay, yep, got it, done. Napoleon, got it. And it's like, but pause. Actually, there's three women that you could also put in that. And I would love to introduce you to them. And it, and so it's not don't teach about Robespierre or Napoleon, but there's more to the story. And so I guess in terms of tips, teachers are going to hate me for saying this, but if I was a girl sitting in a history class and a teacher was teaching a lesson on the French Revolution that didn't include a single woman, I would encourage young people to raise their hand and say, what were women doing during this time? And just start asking that question. Where are the women? And if I was the teacher, I would hate it because I'd be put on the spot. But at the same time, my hope is that it would illuminate for the educator and they could be open. I always tell when I'm training teachers, you don't have to know everything. And teachers, you can have the answer. That's a great question. Let's Google it. And maybe you'll find the Remedial Herstory Project in that process. Um, but honestly, I think what young people need to do is start being the challenger in the space if they're
Yeah.
finding that women are being erased. And then I have found a lot of like peace in knowing that women are there. And every time I've looked for women, they're there. Um, this was a really interesting one. We wrote we have an online textbook that teachers can use. It's free. And we wrote a section on the polio vaccine. And obviously, Jonas Salk, male discoverer of the vaccine. And what the author ended up doing was like writing about how this vaccine improved the lives of mothers raising children under the threat of polio. And I thought, oh, that's like, obviously that's great. But also, weren't there women involved in the development of the vaccine itself? Like, where are these scientists, right? And the moment I asked the question, it didn't take a complicated researcher to do a little Googling to find the women that were there. So even in cases where, you could certainly cover polio with a gendered lens, I found even there, women were in the room. And, literally, we can find those people. The example I use a lot, and I used in our TED Talk, is D-Day. Women were banned from being on the boats, being on the beaches, being involved, and yet Martha Gellhorn stowed away on a ship because she was a journalist and wanted to be there with the male journalists to write the biggest story of the year, the century, probably, right? Marie Louise Osmont was living in her home, keeping a diary on the French bluffs overlooking the beaches. Right? Like there were women who were present, even though they literally weren't allowed to be there. And so we can find those people. And so if you're feeling, like if you're feeling victimized by the history that you're learning, I would say find solace in knowing that that's just about the presentation. It's not about the reality. And so women are half of the population of the world. So
Yeah.
they're there, right? We can find solace in knowing that they exist. Um, and then my other tip, I guess, would be take up space. Um, I I don't know that I did this well as a young person, and I really want to credit my poli-sci professor in that freshman seminar. Um, it was like a week into classes, and he pulled me aside in the hall as we were all exiting the room, and he was like, "I just want you to know you belong in this class." And that was really awesome of him, Dr. Roberts. And I think um, it's hard to know that you belong in a space where there's no one like you in the space. And I don't know that I was confident enough to say poli-sci is the major for me. It was nice to have a professor, a male professor, say that I could hack it in in this room. And I guess if I could talk to my younger self, I would say you don't need that professor to tell you that. Take up the space. You got this.
Yeah, Kelsie, I think that's so powerful. And really, we need many more Dr. Roberts who
Yeah.
are real allies. And that's a really important component going forwards. Kelsie, I love you are basically providing the material and the facts and the stories for us as a society to then turn that into the stories that get shown in the media, in movies and so on and so on. And I think everything you talk about, we see that, of course, in history, but we also see that in the podcasting world and the book publishing world, etc. pp. So these are all areas where we need to take those stories and turn them into something that is more widely available, that is teaching people stories, role models, facts and materials for us to change how we look at the world and how it was, and so then we can find a way forward. What do you feel are your challenges? What are your biggest challenges, and how do you reframe them to find a way forward?
I think there's a lot of barriers to entry with people. And, we live in a really polarized society right now, at least in the US. And I live in a pretty purple state. Um, so I feel it, every day. And I think the really tricky thing is one of the barriers and one of the problems I see in the way women do get included is, and actually this was really funny. So Women's History Month is in March, and our university had this display of all these amazing women in history that you should know. And I was going through and I was looking at them, and every one of them was like a radical liberal or socialist, in one way or
Mm,
another.
mm,
And I have no problem, obviously, with those women being taught in schools. Um, but I think that that is an example of the oversimplification of women's history, that women are like that all women are feminists, or that all women agree on blah 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 blah. And history gets whitewashed. Women's history also gets whitewashed. Um, and I think one of the barriers is that people don't understand women's history is just as diverse as male history is, and that women debated each other, disagreed with each other, had very, they might have been allies in an effort like suffrage, but within that effort, you've got um, Southern women's groups, Northern women's groups, Black women's groups, Indigenous women's groups. They're just trying to be citizens, right? So like we've got all these in U.S. history, and I think I am not an expert in British suffrage, but I think it's pretty much the same,
it's the
right?
same. Yeah.
You've got all these different groups of women they all want the right to vote, but yet there's a lot of division in there. And I think if people understood that about women's history, that it really is diverse. There are conservative women who were anti-suffrage, right? There are more progressive and liberal women who wanted suffrage. There were there were all these heiresses who funded suffrage efforts and funded anti-suffrage efforts, right? Like, if we appreciated that, then I think it wouldn't be so scary to teach about women's history. And sadly, I think some of those like Women's History Month efforts to highlight those women actually do women's history a disservice, because people go, well, I don't want to teach about all these feminists, right? Because I'm conservative or whatever. And they don't realize there's so many conservative women that you could be teaching about in your classes. And it makes
Yeah.
you, so I think that's a barrier. And obviously this falls under the category of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that are being targeted in my country right now. And the moment I say inclusion, it's a trigger point for people. And I think those barriers of bias or challenges of getting through people's perception of what they think I'm talking about is is the biggest issue. And I am progressive, and I do think that if we talked about women's history, we would start to see, especially on issues of reproductive justice, maternity leave, like we would see the ways, if we studied this more, that those sort of progressive solutions to these problems are probably a good idea, right? But I think we only get there, and this is my personal beliefs are really different from my pedagogical beliefs, and my pedagogical beliefs are that, and pedagogy is the science of teaching or the practice of teaching, it are that real learning happens when we get to engage in the discussions and the debates. And so every lesson plan that the Remedial Herstory Project has built allows multiple perspectives to be aired in the story. Because I think when you hear some of the voices of anti-suffrage, you go, oh, okay, I get why they're concerned about that, right? Like one of the concerns was that women don't have degrees in business and engineering and science because they were banned from those degrees, but they don't have these degrees. So why should they weigh in and tell the government what to do? And obviously, there's some inherent misogyny, there's structural problems there, whatever. But underneath that is a value that I share, which is that the voter, the electorate should be educated. I agree. Yes. So how do we get women to the point where they have the same opportunity to be educated on those things that their male peers have? It becomes my question, right? It didn't change that I would have favored suffrage had I lived through that time, but I'm actually a more thoughtful person by hearing what is concerning to anti-suffragists. And I think the same on reproductive justice, right? If we let students read perspectives that are pro-choice, perspectives that are pro-life, pro-abortion, I don't know what all the pros are, but put all the pros out there,
Yeah.
then people become more informed on that issue. And to me, my data brain has definitely been present here, but to me, the data on abortion speaks for itself, but people don't know the data, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if you care about babies, if you care about women, there's a very clear answer here that will save many, many lives. But because we don't actually look at the data and because we're not allowing multiple perspectives to be aired in a lot of conversations about that, we're not really learning. We're not really understanding each other, and we're not really finding the points that a majority of people actually do agree on. So
Yeah.
my hope is that the style of lessons we've developed will help resolve some of that too.
Kelsie, and I think you had such unbelievably important points. We have to have the grace and the respect to have all the conversations, to see things from all the different sides, to take informed decisions, right? And everybody, that should be a basic human right. And everybody should be educated to find what unites us and not what divides us. And I sometimes feel we are being fed the story that we're so divided, and we buy into it, and therefore we have bias right from the start. And the person very much on the right hears one word and thinks this is a socialist, and therefore I'm not listening. And so we've come to a place where we are almost unable to hold the conversations that are so important to be had, which is why I'm so grateful to be talking to you today, Kelsie. And yesterday I talked to Amanda Zorowski, who's a reproductive rights activist who almost died in the state of Texas and then took them to court. And, there's a documentary about her case and so on. I mean, there are so many incredible women trying to do the work that is based on the data and the facts, and that are willing to lean in and have the conversations that are difficult conversations to be had. And they go definitely against this narrative that we are being fed of being so divided, which I don't think. I think if we go from house to house in any country, including America, we will find more that unites us than divides us. And that's the type of stories we need to tell. And you are telling those stories, and you're providing the material for other people to tell those stories, which I think is so important.
Mm.
Kelsie, so what do you feel you're most proud of?
Oh, I am really proud of, I grew up in a time when I don't know if a lot of people agree with this, but I felt like all these rivalries, from celebrities to catty girls in schools to, like girls weren't allowed to be friends. Just
Mm,
like
absolutely.
we had to be competing over a guy or competing over da 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 da. And honestly, one of the best parts about all of this work was realizing I couldn't do this alone. I started building the early lessons for RHP were things I built by myself. I realized I couldn't do this alone. And one of the first people that I brought in on this was my friend Brooke Sullivan. She's the co-host on my podcast, and she is not a historian or a teacher, but she is a force. And I learned a lot from her about the power of female friendships. And I guess the thing I'm most proud of is the team of women and men that are working behind the scenes on our project. And just sometimes we have to be like in our board meetings, like, hey guys, so I know we all love each other, but could we get something accomplished related to the budget or related to, whatever is? And it is really nice to have this team of women that wants everyone to be successful. And, this year, many of our board members published books. And, as the books would come out, there would be these like celebratory posts and emails and cheers. And I'm just so proud of what everyone has accomplished on our board this year. And I feel so incredibly supported by them. And I don't feel like, yeah, I'm really proud of the community. And we have, over 100 scholars who've contributed to the work of RHP. And, we've had all these awesome men involved in the work. We actually have two men that are helping to write the European textbook that we're drafting right now. One of my favorite men that I've encountered is the First Ladies man. He studied the First Ladies for C-SPAN, and you should definitely check him out. He has a whole book on it. But just this amazing community that we've brought together around service, around supporting women, cheering for each other, supporting scholars and scholarship, and supporting teachers. And I just think because we've grounded it in this like attitude of service and positivity and cheers, it's the coolest community. So it's been really fun I'm really just proud of that.
Kelsey, and I love what you said just now as well. There is space for all of us. There is enough space for all of us. We can all come out with our own books and we can all, and cheer each other on. We don't have to be pitted against each other. There is space for all of us. And that's a really important point, Kelsey. And so my next question is very much related. You are obviously leading with your story. You're a leader. What kind of a leader are you, and what kind of a leader do you want to be?
Oh, I've done a bunch of leadership courses. So for those of you familiar with the north, south, east, west thing, I am very much a north, which is like, let's just keep this train a moving, folks. So that's another beautiful part about the team is I have many weaknesses as a leader, which is sometimes not pausing to take in what people need and where people are at. And I'm just really, Brooke is a people person. So while I'm plowing ahead with the trail I'm blazing, she's like, would anyone like snacks? She's just awesome. And so I have people who sort of rein me in a little bit when I need to be reined in. And I think, that is the what I've learned about myself as a leader is that I need to bring on those people whose perspectives I need to hold me accountable to the leader that I want to be. But I very much plow ahead. I am very energetic, very passionate, very, there's a lot of emotion and enthusiasm behind what I do. And I think that those types, those are the types of leaders in schools that got called bossy a lot. I was called bossy my whole life. I put on, shows and was captain of sports teams and, all those sorts of things. And I, over time, had to learn not to dull my light, which is sometimes how that was shared, some bad leaders in my life were like, hey, be less. And, those people I had to learn to ignore. But there is some truth and grain of truth in that feedback, which is you're you're missing bits of the group dynamic or the purpose of whatever initiative we're working towards. And so I had to learn, and I probably still have to learn how to value, I I feel like I'm a train that's just like moving, and when those voices come up, it feels like they're trying to slow me down. And so I want to discredit them, like the train's moving, get on board. And I had to train my brain to say, maybe there's merit in slowing down and it's not stopping. Like my brain wants to not stop. And so I had to train my brain to say, they're not telling me to stop and they're not
Mm.
telling me that this is a bad idea. They're just telling me that we will get there faster if we consider X, Y, and Z. And speed is definitely a piece of how my brain operates sometimes. But yeah, I am textbook north, and I've had to learn to find a more moderate ground.
Kelsey, and I love that as well because that is not just you, that's so many. And I definitely feel a little bit like that as well. And it's qualities we acquire over time which really serve us then because we are able to then bring everyone to the table. And don't feel so much like the train is coming to a standstill.
Mhm.
Kelsey, so tell us your goals and plans for 2025
Oh, I
and
am
beyond.
and beyond. We are moving the Remedial Herstory Project into an outreach phase. We feel like we have a really awesome, I don't want to say product because we give it away for free. Product makes it sound like we're selling something to people. But we're a nonprofit. Our goal is to provide these tools to teachers and support teachers, and part of that mission is that it's free. But we are moving into a phase to try to bring more schools on board, more teachers on board to get this in more classrooms around the country and world. Um, and really, I am shifting in. I did a lot of building for RHP in the early years, and we've restructured our organization. And now I'm doing a lot of leading and guiding and directing. And it's a new phase and era for us as we're figuring that out. But I'm really excited about it. And honestly, I feel like I have I started this journey because I didn't know women's history. So I have never claimed to say that I know everything about women's history that there is to know. And I think we're at a point where, more scholars and other people who have knowledge to contribute to our project are deeply needed. And so I'm really stepping into this, how do we get those people involved with us role, and letting other people um, uh, contribute and chime in and support the work. So it's a really fun time. I'm working on a couple other books related to social studies, not related to women. I mean, the tricky thing about social studies is that yes, I'm advocating for women's history, but if schools are cutting time dedicated to the teaching of history at all, then
Mm.
like, that presents a whole barrier too, right? So I'm doing a lot of advocacy in my state right now, about the importance of teaching just social studies. And then when I get the teachers in the room, I say, okay, yeah, and women, but broadly social studies. And then sadly, in the United States, there's this really counterproductive voucher movement. And so I'm doing a lot of work to try to advocate just for public schools in general.
Mm.
And, studies show that in theory, vouchers sound like a really great idea, but studies have consistently shown learning loss in every place that those voucher programs have been introduced. And so I'm shifting in my professor job into a much more like, let me provide scholarship and data just to defend schools, to defend social studies, to protect teachers from being attacked, and that sort of issue. Because, we can't even have conversations about women's history if we're not even allowed to just teach in schools.
Yeah, yeah. Kelsie, so what do you want people to take away from your story?
Two things can be true at the same time. There can be structural barriers to um, women, moving forward in career, in access and in opportunity. And if you dig in deep enough, you can really do anything. And I don't think you should have to give it your whole life. The Remedial Herstory Project was built on a lot of volunteer time, because the powers that be do not fund. It's something like 2% of philanthropic giving goes to women and girl projects working on women and girls. And so, we have perennially been in a funding crisis. And that has been resolved because no one who works in this area thinks, yeah, you know what? We teach enough women's history, right? Like and so people are willing to dedicate time in kind to this work. And so, like it has not, there was no trail here, and we blazed that trail with a lot of sweat, with a lot of donated time. And I don't think you should have to do that, but you can do that, and like change can happen regardless of structural barriers, right? Like, and you can accomplish, if your dream is to be a pro athlete, like do it. Let's go. Like, I think a lot about structural things that I faced as a kid. I played sports growing up, and I really wanted to be an ice hockey player, and there were no girls' ice hockey teams in the town that I grew up in. And so my mom and dad put me on a boys' team. I played boys' ice hockey for like 3 years, like just do it, like you can do that. You can blaze that trail. Like I experienced inequitable policies at the high school level. We got hand-me-down jerseys from the boys' teams that were like balloons on us. Like I remember all those things. And I'm a lifelong athlete. Like that didn't stop it. Like you can still do those things. So I guess as with a lot of my lessons that I teach in social studies classes, two things can be true at the same time, right? Like there can be structural problems and we can be a force.
Kelsie, I am so unbelievably excited and grateful for your time, your story, and your insights because they touched on so many incredibly important things and blast a way forward for all of us as a global society to build on making this world a more balanced place, a place where we are listening to each other, where we find the grace and the respect to do that, to bring about change. And we all know we need change because we are really in two corners, and this is not a way to go forwards. And I think you can only build solutions when you have all the facts on the table. You can't find solutions based on lies or semi-truths or imbalanced ways of presenting the facts. So and you're a really important tool, person in bringing about that change. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on and for bringing, just hearing some of the people you're interviewing. I'm like, man, this is such important work to keep these stories going. So thank you for what you do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kelsie, for your amazing work of compiling women in history so that teachers can teach that to students across the US and the world. Thank you for creating a more inclusive and equal past that will inform our young students, creating role models for girls from a historic perspective. Those stories create a more equal future and make our next generations not only better educated, but better allies for each other. You're an instrument for good, Kelsie. Thank you for creating more balanced education material and for voicing your experiences and insights. We always need graceful conversations and role models with different convictions, opinions, not just from the far ends of the right or the left. We need to build bridges, and that's what you're doing. So thank you so much for your amazing work and for coming to talk to me on She Can.